Billionaire divorced for 5 months froze. Seeing his ex-wife leave a hospital with a baby on Christmas. Welcome to Secrets Narrated. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. When the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10 and share what you felt along the way. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with twists and hidden truths, make sure to follow Secrets Narrated so you don't miss the next one. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy every detail. The automatic doors of St. Mary's Hospital slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing the sterile scent of antiseptic into the crisp December air. Miles Harrington stepped inside, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence that came from building a medical technology empire worth $3 billion. But today, every step felt heavy. His charcoal gray suit was impeccable, tailored to perfection across his broad shoulders and athletic frame. Dark hair, streaked with distinguished silver at the temples, was styled with precision. Steel blue eyes that had intimidated boardrooms across Silicon Valley now held something different, a weariness that expensive skincare couldn't hide. Miles had never planned to spend Christmas Eve in a hospital. The irony wasn't lost on him that his company's devices probably monitored half the patients in this building, yet he'd rather be anywhere else. His Aunt Margaret's hip surgery could have waited until after the holidays, but family obligations were the one thing his assistant couldn't reschedule. 5 months. That's how long it had been since he'd signed those divorce papers. 5 months since he'd walked away from the only woman who'd ever made him feel completely alive. The decision had seemed logical then, necessary even. He'd convinced himself that Elena Foster was holding him back, that their relationship had become a weight dragging him down when he needed to soar. Freedom, he'd told himself. Space to breathe. Room to become the man he was meant to be. What came instead was a hollow ache that no amount of work could fill. Miles checked his Rolex, a nervous habit he'd developed since the divorce. The quicker he could get through this visit, the better. Christmas had lost its magic anyway. The penthouse that once felt like a sanctuary now echoed with memories of Elena's laughter, the scent of her vanilla perfume, the way she used to curl up against him during holiday movies. He'd tried everything to forget. Therapy sessions with Manhattan's most expensive psychiatrist, antidepressants that left him feeling numb, anti-anxiety medication that barely took the edge off the panic attacks that struck at 3 in the morning. Nothing worked because nothing addressed the real problem. He'd thrown away the best thing that ever happened to him. Elena had been 24 when they met, a graduate student working part-time at the coffee shop near his first cramped office. She was beautiful in an understated way. Shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the light when she moved, warm hazel eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed walls, and a smile that made him forget about quarterly projections and investor meetings. She'd believed in him when his company was nothing more than a crazy idea and maxed-out credit cards. Elena had eaten ramen noodles for months so they could afford prototype materials. She'd held him through the nights when he was sure they'd lose everything, whispering that she knew he'd change the world someday. But success had changed him. The gentleman who used to bring her flowers just because became someone who snapped when dinner wasn't ready by 7. The dreamer who talked about building a life together became obsessed with building an empire instead. Elena started disappearing inside her own home, her light dimming a little more each day as Miles grew more demanding, more distant, more impossible to please. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal quarter when 3 major deals fell through. Miles had been working 18-hour days, surviving on caffeine and fury. When Elena gently suggested he take a weekend off, he'd exploded. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he'd shouted, his voice echoing through their Manhattan apartment. "While you're here reading books and arranging flowers, I'm trying to keep us from losing everything." The hurt in Elena's eyes had been immediate and devastating, but Miles was too consumed by his own stress to apologize. Instead, he'd grabbed his laptop and stormed out, spending the night at the office like he had so many times before. 2 weeks later, he'd asked for a divorce. "I need space," he'd told her, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "This isn't working anymore. We want different things." Elena had listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap, tears sliding down her cheeks without a sound. She didn't fight him. She didn't beg. She just nodded and said, "If that's what you want." It was what he thought he wanted, for about 3 weeks. Now standing in this hospital corridor decorated with cheerful Christmas garland, Miles felt the familiar weight of regret pressing down on his chest. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, about a conference call with Tokyo, but he ignored it. Business could wait. The elevator dinged softly, and Miles stepped inside, watching the numbers climb toward the orthopedic wing. His reflection stared back at him from the polished steel doors. Successful, powerful, and utterly alone. He'd built his empire. He'd become the man he thought he wanted to be. But in the process, he'd lost the only person who'd ever made him feel like he was already enough. As the elevator slowed to a stop, Miles straightened his tie and prepared to play the part of the dutiful nephew. Just a quick visit, some small talk about recovery times and physical therapy, and then he could escape back to his empty penthouse where the silence couldn't mock him quite as loudly. The doors slid open, revealing the bustling hospital floor ahead. He had no idea that everything he'd tried so hard to leave behind was about to walk right back into his life. What do you think Miles will discover that will change everything he thought he knew about his choices? Miles found room 412 after wandering the maze of hospital corridors longer than necessary. He'd deliberately taken the scenic route, delaying the inevitable small talk that family obligations demanded. The orthopedic wing buzzed with activity, nurses checking charts, families clustered around doorways, the constant beep of monitoring equipment that his own company had probably manufactured. Aunt Margaret looked smaller than he remembered, propped up against white pillows with her silver hair perfectly styled, despite having surgery 2 days prior. She'd been his mother's older sister, the one who'd stepped in after the car accident when Miles was 17. Margaret had never married, dedicating her life to her career as a federal judge, and to keeping Miles grounded when his ambition threatened to consume everything decent about him. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, her sharp blue eyes so similar to his own, taking inventory of his appearance. Despite the expensive suit and careful grooming, Margaret had always been able to see through his armor. "Merry Christmas to you too, Aunt Maggie." Miles leaned down to kiss her cheek, catching the familiar scent of her Chanel perfume. Some things never changed. "Don't deflect. Sit down and tell me what's eating you alive." She patted the chair beside her bed with the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years making lawyers squirm in her courtroom. Miles reluctantly took the seat, loosening his tie. The hospital room was decorated with a small Christmas tree that some well-meaning volunteer had probably placed there, its tiny lights blinking cheerfully in defiance of the institutional atmosphere. "I'm fine, just tired. End of the year. You know how it is." Bullshit. Margaret's language had grown more colorful since retirement. "You've been fine for 5 months now and you look like you haven't slept properly since the divorce. When's the last time you ate a real meal?" The question caught him off guard. When was the last time? His housekeeper left prepared meals in the refrigerator, but most of them ended up in the garbage untouched. Food had lost its appeal around the same time everything else in his life had turned gray. "I eat," he said lamely. "Coffee and whatever your assistant orders for those endless meetings doesn't count." Margaret shifted in her bed, wincing slightly as her hip protested. "You know, Elena called to check on me after the surgery." Miles's jaw tightened. "She did? Sweet girl. Always was. She asked about my recovery, sent flowers. Those beautiful white orchids by the window are from her." Margaret's voice carried a weight that made Miles uncomfortable. She sounded tired, Miles. Really tired. The words hit him harder than they should have. He'd been so focused on his own pain that he'd barely considered what Elena might be going through. She'd probably had to find a new place to live, rebuild her entire life while he'd simply moved back into his bachelor penthouse and pretended everything was fine. That's nice of her," he managed. "She didn't mention why she sounded so exhausted, but I have my suspicions." Margaret fixed him with the stare that had made seasoned prosecutors confess their sins. "What aren't you telling me?" Miles stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the hospital parking lot. Snow had started falling, coating the cars in a thin layer of white. Christmas Eve snow. Elena had always loved that. She used to say it made everything look like a snow globe. Magical and perfect. "There's nothing to tell. We're divorced. We've both moved on. Have you?" The simple question hung in the air between them. Miles watched a young family walking toward the hospital entrance, father carrying a car seat, mother clutching a diaper bag, older child skipping beside them. Such ordinary happiness, the kind he'd once taken for granted. "She was pregnant," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Margaret went very still. "Was? Was, I don't know." Miles pressed his forehead against the cool glass. "She told me the day we signed the papers 3 months along." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft beeping of Margaret's heart monitor. When she finally spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. And I told her I didn't want anything to do with it, that she could raise the child alone. The admission tasted bitter. I haven't seen her since. Margaret's sharp intake of breath cut through him like a blade. In 42 years he'd disappointed her before, but never like this. Never in a way that made her look at him like she was seeing a stranger. My God, Miles. What kind of man have you become? The question echoed his own thoughts during those sleepless nights when the pills didn't work and the silence of his penthouse became deafening. Success had a price, and somewhere along the way, he'd paid it with pieces of his soul. I panicked, he said, though the excuse sounded pathetic even to him. Everything was falling apart. The business, my head, everything. I thought I was protecting her. From what? From me. From this. He gestured vaguely at himself. From the mess I'd become. Margaret shook her head slowly. That baby would be due soon. Christmas, Miles whispered. She said Christmas. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Today was Christmas Eve. Elena could be in labor right now, alone, while he stood in this hospital room drowning in his own cowardice. You need to find her, Margaret said softly, before it's too late. It's already too late. I made my choice. Choices can be unmade. Pride can be swallowed. But some chances, Margaret's voice cracked slightly, some chances don't come around twice. Miles turned from the window, meeting her eyes. They were wet with unshed tears, and the sight broke something inside him that had been carefully held together with money and medication. I don't know how, he admitted. You start by admitting you were wrong. Then you figure out how to be the man she fell in love with instead of this hollow shell wearing expensive suits. Before Miles could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from his driver. Waiting outside whenever you're ready, sir. I should go, Miles said, though he made no move toward the door. Yes, you should, but not to that empty penthouse. Margaret reached for his hand with surprising strength. Find her, Miles. Find them both, before you lose the only thing that ever really mattered. As Miles leaned down to kiss his aunt goodbye, he caught sight of the parking lot again. A woman was walking slowly toward the main entrance, moving carefully like someone carrying something precious. Even from this distance, even with snow obscuring his view, something about her made his breath catch. The hair color was right. The height was right. The way she moved. His heart stopped. Elena. And she was heading straight into the hospital where he stood frozen, watching his past and future collide in the falling snow. Miles's legs moved before his mind could process what he was seeing. He left Margaret's room without a proper goodbye, his Italian leather shoes echoing against the hospital corridors as he half walked, half ran toward the main entrance. His heart hammered against his ribs with a violence that made him wonder if this was what a heart attack felt like. The elevator seemed to take an eternity. He watched the numbers descend. 4th floor, 3rd, 2nd. Each ding marking time in slow motion. When the doors finally opened to the main lobby, Miles stepped out into a world that felt fundamentally different than the one he'd entered an hour ago. The lobby was bustling with Christmas Eve activity, families visiting patients, medical staff heading home for the holiday, volunteers distributing small gifts to children in the pediatric ward. But Miles saw none of it. His entire focus was on the automatic doors at the far end of the space, where he'd last seen that familiar silhouette walking through the snow. He positioned himself near a bank of chairs by the main entrance, trying to look casual while his pulse thundered in his ears. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe it hadn't been Elena at all. Maybe his guilt-ridden mind was playing tricks on him, projecting her image onto some stranger because the doors slid open, and there she was. Elena Foster stepped into the hospital lobby moving slowly, deliberately, like someone carrying something infinitely precious. She wore a long wool coat the color of deep burgundy, her auburn hair longer than he remembered, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. But it was what she carried that made Miles's world tilt off its axis. A baby, tiny, wrapped in a soft cream-colored blanket, cradled against her chest with the protective instinct of a mother who'd learned to be everything to someone who depended entirely on her. Miles felt his knees go weak. The baby was real. His child, the child he'd rejected, dismissed, abandoned, was here, breathing, alive, perfect. Elena looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleepless nights. There were shadows under her hazel eyes that spoke of weeks spent navigating new motherhood alone. Her skin was paler than he remembered, and she moved with the careful gait of someone still recovering from childbirth. But even exhausted, even worn down by circumstances he'd forced upon her, she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She approached the information desk, her voice soft as she spoke to the volunteer, probably asking for directions to a patient's room. Miles couldn't hear the words, but he could see the gentle way she adjusted the baby's blanket, the automatic sway in her posture that new mothers develop to keep their children calm. 2 days old, the premise had said. This baby was 2 days old, which meant Elena had given birth on December 22nd, alone, while Miles was probably in some pointless board meeting or nursing his third scotch of the evening in his empty penthouse. The volunteer pointed Elena toward the elevators, and she turned, walking directly toward where Miles sat frozen in his chair. For a moment, he considered running, ducking behind the information pillar, taking the stairs, anything to avoid the confrontation that was about to destroy whatever fragile peace he'd managed to construct over the past 5 months. But his legs wouldn't move. He could only sit there, watching as the mother of his child, the woman he'd loved and lost and abandoned, walked closer with each step. Elena was about 10 feet away when she saw him. She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening with a shock that quickly gave way to something harder to read. Not anger exactly, not surprise either. Something that looked almost like resignation, as if she'd known this moment would come eventually and had simply been waiting for it. Miles. Her voice was steady, carefully controlled. The baby stirred slightly at the sound, making a soft mewling noise that hit Miles like a physical blow. Elena. His own voice came out rougher than intended. He stood slowly, his hands shaking as he shoved them into his pockets. I didn't expect to see you here. My friend Rebecca had her appendix out yesterday. I was visiting. Elena's explanation was matter-of-fact, but her grip on the baby had tightened protectively. What about you? My aunt. Hip surgery. The words felt incredibly stupid given the enormity of what stood between them. Here they were, making small talk while their child, slept peacefully in her arms. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with 5 months of hurt and words that couldn't be taken back. Hospital life continued around them. Announcements over the PA system, the soft squeak of wheelchair wheels, conversations in a dozen languages. But Miles felt suspended in a bubble where only the 3 of them existed. The baby, he started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. What did you say to the woman whose pregnancy you'd rejected? How did you ask about a child you'd claimed you never wanted to meet? His name is Alexander. Elena's voice was soft but firm. Alexander James Foster. Foster. She'd kept her maiden name, of course. Miles had no right to expect otherwise, but the choice still stung. His son wouldn't even carry his name. Alexander, Miles repeated, the syllables feeling foreign on his tongue. That's a good name. Elena didn't respond. She was studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she could see every sleepless night, every moment of regret, every pill he'd swallowed trying to numb the pain of losing her. You look thin, she said finally. The observation, delivered without malice but with a detachment that hurt more than anger would have, made Miles acutely aware of how much weight he'd lost. His suits hung differently now. His housekeeper had started leaving larger portions, worried about his declining appetite. You look tired, he countered, then immediately regretted the words. Of course she was tired. She'd just given birth. She was raising a newborn alone because he'd been too much of a coward to face responsibility. I am tired, Elena said simply, but that comes with the territory. Another silence. Alexander made another small sound, and Elena automatically began the gentle swaying motion that Miles was learning was universal among new mothers. The simple gesture, so natural, so instinctive, highlighted everything he'd missed, everything he'd chosen to miss. Elena, he began, but she cut him off with a slight shake of her head. Don't, she said quietly. Not here, not like this. She was right. The hospital lobby, surrounded by strangers and Christmas decorations, wasn't the place for the conversation they needed to have. But Miles felt desperate, like if he let her walk away now he might never get another chance. Can we talk? Somewhere private? His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Elena looked down at Alexander, who had fallen back into the peaceful sleep of the very young, then back at Miles. For a moment he thought she might refuse. She had every right to. He'd forfeited his claim to her time, her consideration, her forgiveness the day he'd told her to raise their child alone. There's a chapel on the 2nd floor, she said finally. It's usually empty this time of day. Miles nodded, relief flooding through him even as terror gripped his chest. He was about to face the consequences of the worst decision he'd ever made, and he had no idea if there was any path forward that didn't end in complete devastation. As Elena moved toward the elevators, Alexander still sleeping peacefully in her arms, Miles followed at a respectful distance. His son, his beautiful, perfect son who didn't even know he existed. The elevator doors closed around the three of them, and Miles caught his reflection in the polished steel. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who'd lost everything that mattered and was only just beginning to understand the true cost of his choices. The chapel on the second floor was indeed empty, a small sanctuary tucked away from the medical chaos beyond its doors. Soft light filtered through stained glass windows depicting scenes of healing and hope. Wooden pews faced a simple altar adorned with white poinsettias, someone's donation to bring Christmas spirit to those seeking solace in their darkest hours. Elena chose a pew near the back, settling carefully with Alexander still sleeping against her chest. Miles sat in the same row but left a respectful distance between them, close enough to see the gentle rise and fall of his son's breathing, far enough to honor the invisible barrier that his choices had created. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and 5 months of separate grief. Miles studied Elena's profile in the colored light from the windows, the delicate curve of her nose, the way she unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the protective curve of her body around their child. She looked older, he realized, not just tired, but aged in the way that profound loss could age someone. "How was the birth?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper in the sacred space. Elena didn't look at him. "Difficult," she said simply. 22 hours of labor. The cord was wrapped around his neck, so they had to do an emergency C-section at the end. Miles felt something cold grip his chest. Was he okay? He is now. Elena's hand moved protectively over Alexander's back. The doctors said it was touch and go for a few minutes. His heart rate dropped dangerously low. The words hit Miles like physical blows. His son had nearly died, and he hadn't even known. While Elena was fighting for both their lives in an operating room, he'd probably been reviewing quarterly reports or arguing with his legal team about some meaningless acquisition. "Elena, I called you," she said quietly, still not meeting his eyes. When the contractions started getting close together, it was 2 a.m. on the 22nd. Miles's breath caught. He remembered that night. He'd turned off his phone around midnight after taking an Ambien, determined to get at least 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep before a morning presentation. His assistant handled all calls after hours unless it was a genuine emergency. "I called 3 times, Elena continued. "The last time was when they were wheeling me into surgery. I thought maybe you'd changed your mind. That maybe when it came down to it you'd want to know if your son was going to make it." The chapel's peaceful atmosphere felt like mockery now. Miles wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and never face the consequences of his willful blindness. She'd reached out to him in her moment of greatest fear, and he'd chosen pharmaceutical oblivion instead. "I turned off my phone," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I'm so fucking sorry." "Language," Elena murmured automatically, glancing down at Alexander even though he was far too young to understand. The maternal instinct was so immediate, so natural, that it highlighted everything Miles had missed about becoming a parent. "Sorry," he said again, this time for the profanity. How many more things would he need to learn about being around his son? Elena finally turned to look at him, and the pain in her hazel eyes was devastating. "Do you want to know what the hardest part was? It wasn't the labor. It wasn't even being alone during the surgery. It was filling out the birth certificate afterward." Miles felt his throat close. "What do you mean?" "They asked for the father's name, and I sat there with a pen in my hand, looking at this perfect little boy who'd just fought so hard to be here, and I had to decide whether to write unknown or put down the name of a man who'd made it clear he wanted nothing to do with us." The image of Elena, exhausted and alone, making that impossible choice while he slept peacefully in his king-sized bed, was almost more than Miles could bear. "What did you write?" "Alexander James Foster," she said softly, then paused. "But I also listed you as the father, Miles Harrington, because whatever else you've done, you're still his father. And someday, when he's old enough to ask questions, I want to be able to tell him his mother never tried to erase you from his life." The generosity of that gesture, the grace she'd shown him when he'd deserved nothing but contempt, broke something fundamental inside Miles. Tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in months suddenly burned behind his eyes. Why? His voice cracked. After everything I said, why would you do that? Because, Elena said, shifting Alexander slightly as he made soft sleeping sounds. This isn't about you and me anymore. It's about him. And every child deserves to know where they came from, even if their father wasn't ready to be what they needed. Miles leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. I wasn't ready for any of it. The marriage, the pressure, becoming a father. I thought if I could just get some space, some time to figure myself out. You could have figured yourself out while staying, Elena said with quiet firmness. You could have talked to me instead of shutting me out. You could have gone to therapy, taken a sabbatical, anything except running away from the people who loved you. I know that now. Do you? Elena's voice sharpened slightly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're still running, still choosing the easy path instead of dealing with your problems. Miles lifted his head to meet her gaze. What do you mean? I mean you're here by accident. You didn't come looking for us. You didn't try to find out how Alexander was doing. You're only sitting in this chapel because you happened to be visiting your aunt when I happened to walk through those doors. Elena's voice remained steady, but Miles could hear the hurt underneath. If I hadn't shown up today, would you have ever wondered if your son was healthy, happy, if he had your eyes or your smile? The question hung in the air between them. Miles wanted to lie, to claim he'd been planning to reach out, but Elena had always been able to see through his carefully constructed facades. I was scared, he admitted, terrified that you'd tell me to get lost, that you'd moved on and built a life that was better without me in it. So you decided for both of us that we were better off without you. Yes. Just like you decided we were better off divorced without asking what I wanted. Yes. Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking down at Alexander. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but no less pointed. You know what the irony is, Miles? All those months when you were pulling away, when you were angry and distant and impossible to reach, I kept hoping you'd remember who you used to be. The man who brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, who stayed up all night when I had the flu, making sure I stayed hydrated, who told me he wanted to build something beautiful with me. Miles remembered that man too. He felt like a stranger now, buried under years of stress and ambition, and the desperate need to prove he was more than the scared kid whose parents had died too young. I don't know how to be him anymore, Miles said quietly. Then learn, Elena said, but don't expect me to teach you. I'm too tired to save anyone else right now. I've got my hands full keeping one little person alive and healthy. As if summoned by her words, Alexander stirred in her arms, making the soft mewling sounds that Miles was beginning to recognize as signs of waking up. Elena automatically began the gentle rocking motion, her attention immediately shifting to her son's needs. He's hungry, she said, checking her watch. I need to get home to feed him. The practical reality of Elena's new life, feeding schedules, diaper changes, the endless demands of a newborn, hit Miles with unexpected force. While he'd been drowning in self-pity, she'd been learning to be everything to someone who depended on her completely. Elena, he said as she carefully gathered her purse and prepared to stand. What would I have to do? To be part of his life, I mean. She looked at him for a long moment, Alexander now fully awake and beginning to fuss in her arms. I don't know, Miles, but whatever it is, it would have to be about him. Not about getting me back. Not about easing your guilt. About being the father he deserves consistently, reliably, without drama or conditions or escape clauses. I want to try. Wanting isn't enough, Elena said, standing carefully. Alexander needs more than good intentions. He needs someone who shows up, someone he can count on, someone who won't disappear when things get hard. She paused at the end of the pew, looking back at him one last time. If you're serious about this, Miles, prove it. Don't call me tomorrow with grand gestures and promises. Figure out who you are now, who you want to be, and whether you're capable of putting someone else's needs before your own. Because if you hurt him the way you hurt me, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. As Elena walked out of the chapel carrying their son, Miles remained in the pew, surrounded by stained glass angels and the echo of her challenge. For the first time in months, he had something concrete to focus on. Not getting Elena back. He wasn't sure that was even possible anymore. But becoming worthy of the trust of a 2-day-old boy who didn't even know his name yet. The question was, after everything he'd done, everything he'd failed to be, was it already too late? Miles sat in the chapel for another 20 minutes after Elena left, staring at the stained glass window where colored light painted abstract patterns on the empty pew beside him. The silence that had felt peaceful when they'd first entered now pressed against him like a physical weight, heavy with the echoes of everything Elena had said. Figure out who you are now, who you want to be, and whether you're capable of putting someone else's needs before your own. Her words replayed in his mind as he finally stood and walked back through the hospital corridors. Christmas Eve was winding down around him. Visiting hours were ending, staff was rotating to skeleton crews, and the decorations seemed more garish than festive under the fluorescent lights. When he reached the main entrance, Miles pulled out his phone and called his driver, then immediately hung up. Instead of heading home to his empty penthouse, he found himself walking out into the December evening, letting the cold air shock his system into something approaching clarity. Snow was still falling steadily, muffling the sounds of the city around him. Miles had no destination in mind. He just walked, his expensive suit wholly inadequate for the weather, his Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the sidewalks. For the first time in months, the physical discomfort felt appropriate. He deserved to be cold. He deserved to be uncomfortable. 3 blocks from the hospital, he passed a children's clothing store, its windows decorated with tiny mannequins wearing holiday outfits. Without thinking, Miles stopped, pressing his palm against the cold glass. Newborn sizes, 0–3 months. Little onesies printed with reindeer and snowflakes, impossibly small shoes, blankets soft enough for the most delicate skin. Alexander was 2 days old. What did 2-day-old babies need? What did they wear, eat, think about? Miles realized with crushing clarity that he knew nothing about infants. He could negotiate billion-dollar deals in 3 languages, but he'd never changed a diaper, never warmed a bottle, never soothed a crying child. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. Hope your aunt's visit went well. The Tokyo call has been moved to 9 a.m. your time tomorrow. Merry Christmas. Miles stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, cancel all my meetings for the next week. Family emergency. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The next message went to his personal assistant. I need you to research something for me. Everything about newborn care. Books, classes, whatever new fathers are supposed to know. Also, find me the best child psychologists in the city, ones who work with fathers who are starting late. Then, before he lost his nerve entirely, he called Dr. Claire Mitchell, the psychiatrist he'd been seeing sporadically since the divorce. Her voicemail picked up immediately. Of course, it was Christmas Eve, but he left a message anyway. Dr. Mitchell, it's Miles Harrington. I know it's a holiday, but I need to schedule an emergency session as soon as possible. Something has happened, and I think I'm ready to do the real work now. The work we talked about. Call me back when you can. By the time Miles made it back to his building, his suit was soaked through and his hands were numb with cold. The doorman, Roberto, looked concerned as he held the door. Mr. Harrington, are you all right? You look like you've been walking for hours. I'm fine, Roberto, just needed some air. Miles paused in the marble lobby, looking at his reflection in the polished surfaces. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who'd just had his world turned upside down. Actually, Roberto, can I ask you something? Of course, sir. You have grandchildren, don't you? Roberto's face lit up with pride. 5 of them, ages 2 to 16. What's it like, being responsible for someone so small? Roberto studied Miles's face with the perceptive gaze of someone who'd worked with people long enough to read between the lines. Terrifying, he said simply, and wonderful, but mostly terrifying until you realize that love is more powerful than fear. Miles nodded, processing this wisdom from an unexpected source. Thank you. Congratulations, Mr. Harrington, Roberto said quietly as Miles headed toward the elevator. I hope everything works out. The penthouse felt different when Miles walked in. The same expensive furniture, the same panoramic view of Manhattan, the same oppressive silence. But now it all seemed like a museum exhibit labeled, The Life of a Man Who Had Everything and Nothing. Miles poured himself a scotch, then set it down without drinking. Alcohol had been his escape for months, and Elena's challenge was still ringing in his ears. If he was serious about becoming someone worthy of Alexander's trust, he couldn't keep numbing himself every time reality became uncomfortable. Instead, he sat at his computer and began researching. What did newborns need? How often did they eat? How much sleep did new parents actually get? The information was overwhelming. Websites filled with advice about feeding schedules and sleep training and developmental milestones. Miles felt like he was cramming for the most important exam of his life, one he'd already missed the first class of. Around midnight, his phone rang. Dr. Mitchell, calling back despite the late hour. "Miles, I got your message. You sound different. What's happened?" "I have a son," Miles said, the words feeling surreal even as he spoke them. "He's 2 days old, and I haven't been part of his life at all. His mother, my ex-wife, went through pregnancy and childbirth alone because I told her I didn't want anything to do with the baby." Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. "And how do you feel about that now? Like the worst human being who ever lived?" Miles leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "Like I've wasted 5 months feeling sorry for myself while a woman I claimed to love was building a life without me. Like I might be too broken to ever be what this child deserves. But you want to try. I have to try. I can't live with myself if I don't at least try. This is the breakthrough we've been working toward, Miles. The moment when you stop running from responsibility and start running toward it." Dr. Mitchell's voice was gentle but firm. "It won't be easy. Changing ingrained patterns never is, especially when there's a child involved who can't wait for you to figure yourself out. I know. Are you prepared for the possibility that it might be too late? That Elena might not be willing to let you into Alexander's life?" Miles thought about Elena's exhausted face, the protective way she'd held their son, the careful distance she'd maintained even in the chapel's intimate space. "I have to try anyway," he said. "Even if it's too late for Elena and me, Alexander deserves to know his father tried." After he hung up, Miles returned to his research with renewed focus. By 3 a.m., he'd filled a notebook with information about newborn development, feeding schedules, and safety guidelines. He'd also ordered a dozen books about fatherhood, child psychology, and healthy co-parenting relationships. But the most important thing he did was write a letter he might never send. "Alexander," it began, "you don't know me yet, and I haven't given you any reason to want to, but I'm your father, and I want you to know that your existence has already changed me in ways I didn't think were possible. Your mother is the strongest, most amazing woman I've ever known, and if you grow up to be half as brave and good as she is, you'll be remarkable. I made terrible mistakes before you were born. I was scared and selfish and too proud to admit I needed help. I hurt your mother, and I abandoned both of you when you needed me most. I can't undo those choices, but I can promise you this. I'm going to spend every day for the rest of my life trying to become the father you deserve. I don't know if your mother will ever forgive me enough to let me be part of your life, but whether you grow up knowing me, or just knowing about me, I want you to understand that you were wanted. Maybe not at first, maybe not by someone who was ready to be a good father, but you are wanted now. Completely, desperately, with every broken piece of my heart. I love you already, Alexander. I love you enough to change everything about who I've been." Miles folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. Today actually, since it was now Christmas morning, he would start the real work. Therapy, parenting classes, whatever it took to become someone worthy of holding his son. Outside his windows, snow continued to fall over Manhattan, covering the city in a blanket of white. Christmas morning was dawning on a world that looked completely different than it had 24 hours ago. Miles looked at his reflection in the dark window and saw for the first time in months a man who had something to fight for. The question now was whether it was too late to win. 3 days after Christmas, Miles stood outside the Upper East Side brownstone where Elena now lived, holding a bag from Whole Foods and questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. He'd spent the past 72 hours in a crash course on becoming a better human being, but standing on her doorstep made all his preparation feel inadequate. Dr. Mitchell had squeezed him in for an emergency session on Christmas Day, a gesture that had cost him triple her usual rate, and convinced him she took his commitment seriously. They'd spent 2 hours dissecting his relationship with Elena, his fears about fatherhood, and the emotional walls he'd built around success and control. Transformation isn't about grand gestures, she'd told him. It's about showing up consistently, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Miles had also enrolled in a new father's class that started the following week, ordered every book on infant development Amazon could deliver overnight, and had his first appointment with a family therapist who specialized in rebuilding relationships after abandonment. But none of that preparation had prepared him for the simple act of ringing Elena's doorbell. Before he could lose his nerve, he pressed the button. Footsteps approached slowly, and then Elena's voice came through the intercom, cautious. "Who is it?" "It's Miles. I brought groceries." A long pause. "Miles, what are you doing here? I know you said not to call with grand gestures, he said to the speaker. So I'm not calling. And groceries aren't grand. They're just necessary. You shouldn't have to worry about shopping with a newborn. Another pause. Longer this time. Miles could hear Alexander crying faintly in the background, the sound hitting him like a physical punch. Leave them on the steps, Elena finally said. Thank you. Elena, please, just let me see him for 5 minutes. I swear I'm not here to pressure you or make this about us. I need to see that he's okay. The intercom went silent. Miles stood on the cold concrete steps, breath visible in the winter air, wondering if he'd already failed his first real test. Then the door opened. Elena stood in the doorway wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked exhausted in the way only new mothers could, a bone-deep tiredness that went beyond lack of sleep. But she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. 5 minutes, she said, stepping aside to let him in. Miles followed her into a cozy living room that was nothing like the sterile perfection of their former Manhattan apartment. This space was warm, lived in, with soft throws on the furniture and books stacked on every available surface. A bassinet sat near the couch, and the sound of Alexander's crying was clearer now. Not distressed, just the persistent fussing of a baby who wanted something he couldn't articulate. He's been cluster feeding all morning, Elena explained, moving toward the bassinet. The pediatrician says it's normal, but it's exhausting. She lifted Alexander carefully, automatically beginning the swaying motion that Miles was learning was universal among new mothers. The baby quieted slightly at her touch, but continued the soft whimpering that spoke of discomfort. Can I? Miles set down the groceries and moved closer, his hands halfway extended before he stopped himself. Would it be okay if I held him? Elena studied his face for a moment, then nodded. Support his head and neck. Newborns can't control their head movements yet. Miles accepted his son with shaking hands, marveling at how light Alexander felt, how fragile and perfect. The baby opened his eyes, dark blue, like Elena's, though Miles knew infant eye color could change, and stared at his father with the intense focus that newborns sometimes displayed. Hello, Alexander, Miles whispered, his voice catching. I'm sorry it took me so long to meet you properly. Alexander made a soft sound that might have been a sigh, and Miles felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. This wasn't about Elena anymore, wasn't about his guilt or his need for forgiveness. This tiny person had his own needs, his own personality already beginning to emerge, his own right to be loved unconditionally. He has your nose, Elena said quietly, settling onto the couch, and your stubborn streak. He fights sleep like it's a personal insult. Miles carefully sat in the armchair across from her, still holding Alexander. What else should I know about him? He likes to be swaddled tight when he sleeps. He gets hiccups after every feeding. He's already showing signs of being left-handed. Watch how he curls his fingers. Elena's voice warmed as she talked about their son, the maternal pride evident despite her exhaustion. And he hates having his diaper changed. The crying you heard when you arrived? That was diaper protest. Miles absorbed every detail, filing it away like critical business intelligence. These weren't just random facts about a baby. They were insights into his son's emerging personality, preferences that mattered because Alexander mattered. I've been researching, Miles said carefully, about newborn development, feeding schedules, all of it. I know it doesn't make up for not being here from the beginning, but I want to learn. Elena's expression softened slightly. What kind of research? Everything. Books, websites, parenting forums. I even signed up for a new father's class that starts next week. Miles shifted Alexander to his other arm, surprised by how natural the movement felt. Did you know that newborns can see about 8 to 12 inches clearly? That's exactly the distance from your arms to your face when you're holding them. Evolution designed them to focus on their parents. I didn't know that, Elena said, and Miles caught a hint of the curiosity that had always drawn him to her. She'd been a literature student when they met, someone who collected interesting facts, like other people collected stamps. The instructor said that skin-to-skin contact helps regulate their breathing and heart rate, Miles continued, and that talking to them, even when they can't understand words yet, helps with language development. You talked to an instructor already? Dr. Claire Mitchell. She's the therapist I've been seeing since the divorce. I told her about Alexander, about what happened between us, and she helped me find resources. Miles looked down at his son, who had fallen asleep in his arms. I also have an appointment with a family counselor who specializes in situations like ours. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Miles, what are you hoping to accomplish here? The question was direct but not hostile, and Miles appreciated her honesty. I want to be his father, not just financially. I know you don't need my money. I want to be someone he can count on, someone who shows up when he needs me. And what about us? Miles met her eyes. I don't know. I hope someday we can be friends for his sake. But I'm not here to win you back, Elena. I'm here because I finally understand that being a parent isn't about what I want or what makes me comfortable. It's about what's best for him. Elena nodded slowly. That's actually what I needed to hear. Before Miles could respond, his phone buzzed with a text. He ignored it, but Elena noticed. You can check it, she said. I know your work is important. Miles glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. The message was from his biggest client, threatening to pull their contract if he didn't personally handle a crisis that had emerged over the holiday weekend. 2 weeks ago, he would have handed Alexander back immediately and spent the next 6 hours on emergency conference calls. Instead, he turned off the phone. It's not more important than this, he said simply. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Miles, that could be $1 million client. I've seen you take calls during our anniversary dinner. Then I had my priorities wrong. Miles looked down at Alexander, who was sleeping peacefully despite the adult conversation happening around him. This is the only thing that matters right now. As if testing his resolve, his phone immediately started buzzing with an incoming call. The name on the screen was David Chen, CEO of Titan Medical Group, his most important client, and someone who never accepted being ignored. Miles declined the call and turned off the phone completely. I don't understand, Elena said, but her voice held a note of wonder rather than confusion. Neither do I. Completely, Miles admitted. But for the first time in years, I know what the right choice is. And it's staying here with my son. Alexander stirred in his arms. Making the soft mewing sounds that Elena had explained meant he was getting hungry. Miles felt a surprising pang of disappointment as Elena stood to take the baby. I need to feed him, she explained. Of course. Miles handed Alexander back carefully, missing the weight of him immediately. Elena, can I ask you something? Would you be okay if I came by again tomorrow? Same time, same deal, just groceries and maybe a few minutes with Alexander? I'm not trying to insert myself into your routine. I just want to be consistent. Elena settled Alexander into position for feeding, her movements automatic and efficient. Why tomorrow specifically? Because Dr. Mitchell said consistency matters more than intensity. That showing up regularly, even for short visits, is better than grand gestures followed by long absences. Miles stood to leave, giving her space for the intimate process of feeding their son. And because I promised myself I wouldn't let another day pass without knowing how he's doing. Elena was quiet for so long that Miles thought she might refuse. Finally, she nodded. Same time tomorrow. But Miles, if you're going to do this, you have to really do it. Alexander can't handle the uncertainty of a father who shows up when it's convenient and disappears when life gets complicated. I understand. I hope you do, Elena said softly, because he's already going to have to navigate growing up with divorced parents. I won't let him also grow up wondering if his father actually wants him. Miles paused at the door, looking back at Elena feeding their son in the warm glow of the afternoon light filtering through her windows. The scene was so peaceful, so complete, that he felt like an intruder in their carefully constructed world. But Alexander was his son too, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, Miles felt like he might actually be worthy of that title. I'll see you tomorrow, he said. As he walked back to his car, his phone vibrated with a voicemail from David Chen that he didn't bother to check. Tomorrow he would deal with the professional consequences of putting his son first. Tonight he would research more about newborn feeding schedules and wonder if Elena might someday trust him enough to let him stay longer than 5 minutes. It wasn't much progress, but it was a beginning. The conference room at Harrington Medical Technologies felt more like a tribunal than a business meeting. Miles sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, facing 12 board members whose expressions ranged from concerned to furious. David Chen's empty chair seemed to loom larger than the occupied ones, a stark reminder of the client they'd lost overnight. 48 hours. Richard Blackstone, the lead board member, said without preamble, "You've been unreachable for 48 hours while our biggest contract imploded. Care to explain?" Miles straightened his tie, a nervous habit he'd been trying to break. 3 weeks of daily visits to Elena and Alexander had given him perspective on what truly mattered. But sitting in this room full of men who measured worth in quarterly profits, his newfound priorities felt fragile. There was a family emergency, Miles said carefully. I handled what I could remotely and delegated the rest to the appropriate teams. A family emergency? Catherine Crane, the only woman on the board, leaned forward. Miles, your only family is your aunt and she's recovering nicely from her surgery. We checked. The words hit him like a slap. Of course they'd checked. These people had built careers on knowing every detail about everyone they worked with. The fact that none of them knew about Alexander spoke to how completely he'd compartmentalized his personal life. It's complicated, Miles said. Complicated doesn't begin to cover the shitstorm you've created, snapped Jonathan Torres, whose pharmaceutical division had been counting on the Chen contract. Titan Medical isn't just pulling their business. They're telling everyone in the industry that Harrington Medical is unreliable. Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost us? Miles did know. Roughly $30 million in immediate losses, with potential ripple effects that could reach twice that amount. 2 months ago, those numbers would have sent him into a panic that lasted weeks. Now all he could think about was how Alexander had smiled. Actually smiled, not just gas, during yesterday's visit. I understand the financial implications, Miles said, but sometimes things happen that are more important than money. The room fell silent. Catherine Crane looked like she'd swallowed something unpleasant. Richard Blackstone removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate precision, a gesture Miles recognized as barely contained rage. More important than money? Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. Miles, you built this company on the principle that success requires total dedication. You've fired people for taking vacation during critical projects. You've missed weddings, funerals, and family gatherings because business came first. What could possibly be more important than protecting what we've all spent 15 years building? Before Miles could answer, his assistant knocked on the conference room door. Usually Sandra knew better than to interrupt board meetings, but her expression was urgent. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see Mr. Harrington. She says it's about his son. The words fell into the conference room like a grenade. Miles felt the blood drain from his face as 12 pairs of eyes turned to stare at him with varying degrees of shock and confusion. His what? Catherine Crane's voice cut through the silence. Miles stood quickly. I'll handle this. We can resume the meeting. Sit down, Richard commanded. Sandra, send whoever it is in here. Now. Sir, I don't think that's... Now. Miles wanted to disappear through the floor. In 3 weeks of carefully managed visits with Elena and Alexander, he'd managed to keep his professional and personal lives separate. He'd been building trust slowly, proving his consistency without the pressure of outside scrutiny. Now that fragile progress was about to be exposed to a room full of people who saw vulnerability as weakness. The conference room door opened, and Elena walked in carrying Alexander in his car seat. She looked professional in dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse, her hair pulled back in a low bun, but there were dark circles under her eyes, and she moved with the careful precision of someone operating on very little sleep. Alexander was awake and alert, his dark blue eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. I'm sorry to interrupt, Elena said, addressing the room with the poise Miles remembered from corporate dinner parties. I'm Elena Foster. I wouldn't have come if it wasn't urgent. Miles found his voice. Elena, what's wrong? Is Alexander okay? He's fine, she said quickly, then hesitated. But we need to talk. In private. I'm afraid privacy isn't an option right now, Richard said coldly. Miss Foster, is it? You mentioned Mr. Harrington's son. We weren't aware he had any children. Elena's gaze flicked to Miles, and he saw a flash of understanding in her eyes. She'd walked into a minefield, and his board was about to use their son as ammunition against him. Alexander is 3 weeks old, Elena said simply, lifting the car seat slightly. Miles is his father. The silence that followed was deafening. Miles watched his carefully constructed professional image crumble in real time as the board absorbed this information. Jonathan Torres looked like he was calculating how this revelation would affect stock prices. Catherine Crane's expression had shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like admiration. 3 weeks, Richard repeated slowly. And you're just now telling us about this? Elena, Miles said, standing again. What did you need to tell me? She took a deep breath. Dr. Jennifer Reynolds called this morning. Alexander's bilirubin levels are elevated. It's probably nothing serious, but he needs to go back to the hospital for more tests and possibly phototherapy. Miles felt the world narrow to a single point of focus. Is he in danger? The doctor doesn't think so, but jaundice can be serious in newborns if it's not treated properly. Elena's voice was steady, but Miles could see the fear underneath her calm exterior. I know you're in a meeting, but I thought you should know. In case something happens. Miles was already reaching for his jacket. Let's go. Sit down, Richard commanded again. Miles, you can't just walk out of another emergency meeting because my son might need medical treatment, Miles said, his voice cutting through Richard's protest. That's where I'm going to be. This is exactly what we're talking about, Jonathan Torres exploded. You have responsibilities to this company, to your employees, to your shareholders. You can't just abandon everything every time your personal life gets complicated. Miles turned to face the board, and for the first time in his professional career, he felt absolutely certain about his priorities. You're right, he said calmly. I can't abandon everything every time my personal life gets complicated. But this isn't complicated. This is simple. My 3-week-old son might need medical treatment, and I'm going to be there for him. If you walk out of this room right now, Richard said coldly, we'll have to seriously reconsider your position as CEO. Miles paused at the door, Elena and Alexander beside him. The threat should have terrified him. He'd spent 15 years building this company, sacrificed his marriage and his happiness for this boardroom and these people who were now treating his son like an inconvenience. Then you'll have to reconsider, Miles said. Elena, let's go. As they left the conference room, Miles could hear the explosion of angry voices behind them. Catherine Crane's voice cut through the chaos. For God's sake, the man just found out he's a father. Give him 5 minutes to figure out his priorities. In the elevator, Elena was quiet for a long moment. Alexander had fallen asleep in his car seat, blissfully unaware of the drama his existence had just created. I'm sorry, Elena said finally. I had no idea you hadn't told them about us. It's not your fault, Miles said, though his mind was racing through the implications of what had just happened. You did the right thing coming to get me. How long have his levels been elevated? Dr. Jennifer Reynolds noticed it yesterday during his 2-week checkup, but she wanted to monitor it for 24 hours before making a decision about treatment. Elena shifted the car seat to her other arm. It's common in newborns, especially ones who had difficult births, but it needs to be watched carefully. The elevator opened to the lobby where Sandra was waiting with Miles's coat and car keys. I called your driver, she said quietly. He's waiting outside. And Miles, for what it's worth, you made the right choice. As they walked toward the car, Elena asked, Are you going to lose your job over this? Miles helped her secure Alexander's car seat in the back of the sedan, marveling at how natural the motion had become after 3 weeks of practice. I might, he said honestly, but that's a problem for tomorrow. Today we need to make sure our son is okay. Elena met his eyes over the roof of the car. Our son? Our son, Miles confirmed. For the first time since Christmas Eve, the words felt completely true. As the car pulled away from Harrington Medical Technologies, Miles watched his life's work disappear in the rearview mirror. 3 weeks ago, the sight would have filled him with panic. Now, with Elena beside him and Alexander sleeping peacefully in his car seat, Miles felt something he hadn't experienced in years, complete certainty about what mattered most. The question was whether it was too late to save either his company or his family. The pediatric wing of Mount Sinai Hospital had a different energy than the adult floors Miles had visited just weeks earlier. Everything was smaller, softer, designed to comfort children and their terrified parents. But as Miles sat in the waiting area watching Elena pace with Alexander, nothing about this place felt comforting. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington? A nurse in scrubs printed with cartoon elephants approached them with a clipboard. Foster, Elena corrected automatically. Elena Foster. We're not married. The nurse's expression didn't change, but Miles felt the familiar sting of how complicated their situation had become. 3 weeks of daily visits had created an intimacy around their son, but legally, professionally, socially, they were still strangers navigating an impossible situation. Ms. Foster, we're ready to admit Alexander for phototherapy. Dr. Jennifer Reynolds will explain everything, but I need you to fill out these forms first. Elena took the clipboard with shaking hands. Miles could see the exhaustion in every line of her body, the weight of 3 weeks of single motherhood combined with the terror of watching your newborn face a medical crisis. Hey, Miles said softly, moving closer. Let me help with the paperwork. Elena looked at him for a moment and he could see her internal struggle. For weeks, she'd been handling everything alone, making every decision, filling out every form. Accepting help meant admitting she didn't have to do this by herself anymore. I don't know your social security number, she said finally, or your insurance information. I don't know any of the details. I'd need to put you down as his father. The words were practical, but Miles heard the deeper meaning underneath. They'd been divorced for 8 months, separated for longer. Elena had built a new life, made new plans, learned to exist without him. The fact that she didn't know his current insurance carrier was just a symptom of how completely they'd untangled their lives. I'll fill out what I can, Miles said, taking half the forms. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Dr. Jennifer Reynolds appeared in the waiting area, her kind face serious but not alarmed. Miles had learned to read medical professionals over the years of building equipment for hospitals. The difference between concern and panic was usually visible in their posture and pace. Elena, Miles, Dr. Jennifer Reynolds said, acknowledging them both. Let's talk about Alexander's condition. They followed her to a small consultation room where Alexander lay sleeping in a portable bassinet, a tiny blue hospital bracelet around his impossibly small wrist. Miles felt his chest tighten at the sight of his son in a medical setting, looking so vulnerable under the harsh fluorescent lights. Alexander's bilirubin levels are higher than we'd like to see, Dr. Jennifer Reynolds began, pulling up his chart on a tablet. It's not uncommon in newborns, especially those who had complicated deliveries. The good news is that phototherapy is very effective, and most babies respond well within 24 to 48 hours. What exactly is phototherapy? Miles asked. We place Alexander under special blue lights that help break down the excess bilirubin in his system. He'll need to stay under the lights for most of the day, with breaks for feeding and diaper changes. One of you can stay with him at all times. Elena leaned forward. Are there any risks? Any complications we should worry about? The treatment itself is very safe. The main concern is if the bilirubin levels continue to rise despite treatment, but that's rare. We'll monitor his blood levels every 6 hours and adjust the therapy as needed. Dr. Jennifer Reynolds looked between them. I do want to be honest. Newborn jaundice can be scary for parents, especially new parents. It's normal to feel anxious. Miles thought about the past 3 weeks, how every small change in Alexander's breathing or eating patterns had sent Elena into research mode, texting him updates and questions at all hours. She'd been navigating these fears alone while Miles was just beginning to understand what it meant to worry about someone so completely helpless. How long will he need to stay in the hospital? Elena asked. Probably 2 to 3 days, depending on how quickly his levels improve. We'll want to keep monitoring him even after the phototherapy is finished, just to make sure the levels stay stable. After Dr. Jennifer Reynolds left to prepare Alexander's room, Miles and Elena sat in silence, watching their son sleep. The weight of the situation settled between them. Their first real crisis as parents, and they were facing it as two people who were still figuring out how to be in the same room together. I should call work, Elena said suddenly. I was supposed to start my new job on Monday. They're not going to understand if I need to take more time off before I've even started. Miles looked at her sharply. New job? Marketing coordinator at a publishing house. It's not much, but it's flexible and has good health insurance. Elena's voice was matter-of-fact, but Miles could hear the underlying stress. I can't afford to lose it. The reminder of Elena's financial reality hit Miles like a punch to the stomach. While he'd been drowning in self-pity in his penthouse, she'd been job hunting while pregnant, preparing to support herself and Alexander without any guarantee that Miles would contribute to their lives. You don't need to worry about money, Miles said quietly. I know I haven't been contributing, but that ends now. Alexander is my responsibility too. It's not about money, Miles. Elena's voice carried a note of frustration. It's about having my own life, my own career. I can't just be dependent on you again. The again hung in the air between them. During their marriage, Elena had given up her graduate program to support Miles's business dreams, becoming increasingly isolated as his success grew and their social circle became entirely centered around his work. She'd lost herself in his ambitions, and Miles was finally beginning to understand how suffocating that must have been. I'm not asking you to be dependent on me, Miles said carefully. I'm asking you to let me help with our son so you can have your own life. That's what co-parenting is supposed to look like, right? Before Elena could respond, a nurse appeared to move Alexander to his phototherapy room. Watching them wheel their son's bassinet through the hospital corridors, Miles felt a familiar helplessness, the same feeling he'd had during Elena's difficult pregnancy symptoms, when all his money and connections couldn't fix what was wrong. Alexander's room was small but well-equipped, with a special bassinet that had blue lights built into the ceiling above it. The nurse, whose name tag read Janet, explained how the phototherapy worked while she got Alexander settled. He'll need to wear just his diaper and special eye protection, Janet said, placing tiny goggles over Alexander's eyes. The lights can be harsh, so we need to protect his vision. He might be fussier than usual. The lights can be overstimulating for some babies. As if on cue, Alexander began to cry. Not the hungry or tired cry Miles had learned to recognize, but something more distressed. Elena immediately moved toward the bassinet, her hands hovering over their son without quite touching. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured. "Mama's here, Daddy's here too." The casual way she included Miles in that comfort made his throat tight. For 3 weeks, he'd been a visitor in their lives, someone who showed up for scheduled appointments but missed the midnight feedings and diaper blowouts. Now, in this sterile hospital room, they were functioning as partners for the first time. "Can we both stay?" Miles asked Janet. "Of course. We have a reclining chair that converts to a bed, and there's a couch that's surprisingly comfortable. Most parents find it easier to take shifts. One person tries to rest while the other stays with the baby." After Janet left, Miles and Elena settled into an awkward routine. Elena took the first shift, sitting beside Alexander's bassinet and reading him a story in a soft voice that seemed to calm his fussing. Miles used the time to make phone calls, to his assistant about rearranging his schedule, to his insurance company about adding Alexander as a dependent, to his lawyer about updating his will to include his son. When Elena finally agreed to try to rest, Miles took his place beside the bassinet. Alexander was awake under the blue lights, his tiny hands moving restlessly. Without the eye protection, Miles could see that his son's eyes were tracking movement, following his father's face as he leaned closer. "I know this is scary, buddy," Miles said quietly, "but you're going to be okay. Your mom and I are going to make sure of it." Alexander made a soft sound that might have been recognition. Miles carefully slipped his finger into his son's tiny fist, marveling at the strength of that grip. "I'm sorry I missed the first 3 weeks," Miles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you were born, or when your mom was scared, or when you had your first smile, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." From the couch, Elena's voice was soft but clear. "He can hear you, you know. Babies recognize their parents' voices, even when they're this young." Miles looked over to find Elena watching them, her expression unreadable in the blue-tinted light. "I've been reading to him every night," she said. "The same book my mother used to read to me. I thought it might be nice if he had some consistency, some tradition." "What book?" "Guess How Much I Love You. It's about a little rabbit and his father, and how much they love each other." Elena's voice caught slightly. "I know it's silly, but I wanted him to know about love, even if his parents couldn't figure out how to love each other anymore." Miles felt something break open in his chest. For weeks, Elena had been building a life for Alexander filled with love and security and traditions, while Miles had been trapped in his own guilt and fear. She'd been giving their son everything she could, including the promise of a father's love that Miles hadn't yet proven he could deliver. "It's not silly," Miles said. "And Elena, I never stopped loving you. I just stopped knowing how to show it." Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "Love isn't enough, Miles. I loved you through the end of our marriage, but love doesn't fix communication problems or different priorities, or the fact that you made me feel invisible for 2 years. I know. Alexander needs more than love from his father. He needs reliability, presence, emotional stability. He needs someone who won't disappear when things get difficult." Miles looked down at his son, still gripping his finger with surprising strength. Under the therapeutic blue lights, Alexander looked like he was glowing, like some precious thing that needed to be protected from the world. "Then that's who I'll become," Miles said. "However long it takes, whatever it costs. That's who I'll be for him." Outside the hospital room window, snow was beginning to fall again, coating the city in white. Inside, under the blue lights, 3 people who were still learning how to be a family sat together in the quiet, watching over the smallest and most important member of their complicated constellation. It wasn't the reunion Miles had dreamed of, but it was a beginning, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, that felt like enough. 48 hours later, Alexander's bilirubin levels had dropped to normal, and the blue lights that had bathed his hospital room were finally turned off. Miles watched Dr. Jennifer Reynolds remove the tiny protective goggles from his son's eyes, marveling at how much more alert Alexander seemed without the constant illumination. "His levels are perfect," Dr. Jennifer Reynolds announced, checking the latest blood work results. "Whatever genetic resilience he inherited, it served him well. You can take him home this afternoon." Elena sagged with relief in the bedside chair where she'd spent most of the past 2 days. Miles had brought her changes of clothes, real food to replace the hospital cafeteria offerings, and had taken over the night shifts so she could get actual sleep. They'd developed a rhythm, not the easy intimacy of their marriage, but something new, a partnership built around their shared concern for Alexander. "Thank you," Elena said to Dr. Jennifer Reynolds, "for everything. I know this is routine for you, but it was terrifying for us. First medical crisis is always the hardest. Dr. O. Jennifer Reynolds said kindly, "You both did exactly what you needed to do, stayed calm, followed instructions, and made sure Alexander felt loved and secure. That's what matters." After Dr. Jennifer Reynolds left, Miles helped Elena pack their things, while Alexander slept peacefully in his regular bassinet. No more wires, no more monitors, no more blue lights, just their healthy son, ready to go home. "I should call the office," Elena said, checking her phone. "Let them know I'll be able to start work on Monday after all." Miles paused in folding the blankets Elena had brought from home. "Are you sure you're ready to go back to work so soon? Alexander just got out of the hospital." Elena's expression sharpened. "Miles, we talked about this. I need this job. I can't depend on you for financial support. I'm not asking you to depend on me. I'm asking if you want to take a few more weeks to settle into a routine at home before adding work stress to everything else. Some of us don't have the luxury of taking time off whenever we want," Elena said, then immediately looked like she regretted the words. "I'm sorry. That was unfair. I know you've been here for Alexander." Miles finished folding the blankets, choosing his words carefully. "Elena, what if I told you that money wasn't a concern? That you could take as much time as you needed to be with Alexander without worrying about income?" Elena stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Before Miles could answer, his phone rang. Sandra's name appeared on the screen and Miles felt his stomach drop. He'd been avoiding calls from the office for 2 days, letting everything pile up while he focused on Alexander's health. "I have to take this," he said, stepping into the hallway. "Miles?" Sandra's voice was tight with worry. "Where are you? The board meeting was supposed to start an hour ago." Miles closed his eyes. He'd completely forgotten about the emergency board meeting Richard Blackstone had scheduled to address the fallout from his walkout 2 days earlier. "I'm at the hospital. Alexander is being discharged today." "Miles, listen to me carefully. Richard Blackstone called an emergency vote. They're trying to remove you as CEO. Catherine Crane has been fighting for you, but she's outnumbered. If you don't get here in the next hour, they're going to proceed without you." The words hit Miles like a physical blow. He'd known this was coming, had seen it in Richard's expression when he'd walked out of the last meeting, but hearing it confirmed made his chest tighten with panic. What are they saying? What's their justification? Abandonment of fiduciary duty, failure to prioritize company interests, erratic behavior. Sandra's voice dropped. "Miles, they're painting you as someone who's having a breakdown. They're saying the divorce, the stress, the sudden appearance of a child. They're using all of it to argue that you're not mentally capable of running the company." Miles leaned against the hospital wall, watching through the window as Elena adjusted Alexander's blanket. His son was healthy. His family was safe. But the company he'd built from nothing, the life's work that had cost him his marriage and nearly cost him his relationship with his child, was about to slip away. "How much time do I have?" Miles asked. "Maybe 45 minutes before they vote. Miles, if you lose the CEO position, they'll offer you a consulting role with no real authority. It would be a graceful exit, but it would still be an exit." Miles thought about the man he'd been 2 months ago, someone who would have left Alexander's bedside in the middle of a medical crisis to fight for a boardroom. Someone who valued professional validation more than personal relationships. "Sandra, I need you to do something for me. Anything. Call Catherine Crane. Tell her I'm not coming to the meeting." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Miles, are you sure? Once they vote you out, there's no coming back from this." "I'm sure." Miles watched Elena lift Alexander from his bassinet, the natural grace with which she handled their son highlighting everything he'd missed during his self-imposed exile. "But I need you to schedule a meeting with our financial team for next week. I want to know exactly what my settlement options are. Stock options, severance packages, all of it. What are you planning?" "I'm planning to take care of my family," Miles said. "Whatever that requires." When Miles returned to Alexander's room, Elena was signing discharge papers with a nurse. She looked up as he approached, clearly reading something in his expression. "Everything okay?" Miles sat down beside her, watching Alexander sleep in her arms. Their son looked so peaceful, so completely unaware of the adult complications swirling around him. The board is voting to remove me as CEO in about 30 minutes, Miles said quietly. Elena's eyes widened. What? Why aren't you there fighting for your position? Because I'm here with Alexander with you, where I should have been all along. Miles, that company is your life's work. You can't just let them take it away. Miles met her gaze, seeing the confusion and concern there. For 8 years, Elena had watched him sacrifice everything. Their time together, their social life, their emotional connection, for the sake of building Harrington Medical Technologies. The idea that he would choose to be at the hospital instead of fighting for his professional survival must have seemed impossible. My life's work is supposed to be building something that lasts, Miles said. The company will survive without me. It's successful enough to run itself, but Alexander won't get another chance to have his father present for the important moments. Elena was quiet for a long time, studying his face. What does this mean for your financial situation? For your ability to support Alexander? Miles had run the calculations during the sleepless hours of the past 2 days. Even if he lost his CEO position, his stock holdings and accumulated assets were substantial. He could live comfortably for decades without earning another dollar, and Alexander's college fund could be fully endowed with a fraction of his current wealth. It means we'll be fine, Miles said. More than fine. Elena, if you want to stay home with Alexander for 6 months, a year, whatever feels right, you can. If you want to go back to school, start your own business, pursue anything that got put on hold during our marriage, you can do that too. Elena shifted Alexander to her other arm, her expression unreadable. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to have choices. During our marriage, I made you financially dependent on me, which meant you couldn't leave even when I was making you miserable. I never want you to feel trapped again. By money, by circumstances, by anything. And what do you want, Miles? What do you get out of this arrangement? Miles looked down at Alexander, who had opened his eyes and was staring at him with that intense focus newborns sometimes displayed. I want to be his father, Miles said simply. Not the man who sends checks and shows up for birthdays. I want to know his favorite bedtime story, his first word, what makes him laugh. I want to be someone he can count on, someone who's present for the ordinary days, not just the emergencies. Elena was quiet for so long that Miles wondered if he'd said something wrong. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. What about us? What about our relationship? It was the question Miles had been avoiding, the one that made all his other plans feel incomplete. He wanted Elena back, wanted the warmth of her laugh, the comfort of her understanding, the partnership they'd had before ambition had poisoned everything good between them. But he was beginning to understand that wanting something didn't mean he deserved it. I don't know, Miles said honestly. I hope someday we can be friends. Good friends who can co-parent Alexander without drama or resentment. Beyond that, he shrugged. I can't ask you to trust me with your heart again. I haven't earned that yet. Yet? Elena's voice was soft. I'm hoping that if I prove I can be the father Alexander deserves consistently over time, maybe you'll believe I've learned how to put someone else's needs before my own. Maybe that will be enough foundation to build something new. Elena stood to put Alexander in his car seat for the trip home, and Miles caught a glimpse of something in her expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but something that looked like possibility. Miles, she said as they prepared to leave the hospital room that had become their temporary refuge. Yeah? For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. About the company, I mean. Alexander is more important than any job. As they walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, Miles felt his phone buzzing with what he assumed were messages about the board meeting. He didn't check them. Whatever was happening at Harrington Medical Technologies, it was happening without him. For the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he needed to be. The question now was whether it was enough to build the life he'd never learned how to want. 2 weeks after Alexander's discharge from the hospital, Miles sat in his now former office, packing the personal items that represented 15 years of relentless ambition. The board had voted him out as CEO, just as Sandra had predicted. Catherine Crane had fought for him until the end, but even she couldn't argue with the financial losses his absences had created. The irony wasn't lost on him that he felt more peaceful in this moment of professional defeat than he had during any of his corporate victories. A knock on the door interrupted his packing. He looked up to see Elena standing in the doorway, holding Alexander in his carrier. She looked nervous, uncertain, an expression he rarely saw on her face. Sandra said I could find you here, Elena said. I hope it's okay that I came. Miles set down the box of books he'd been loading. Of course it's okay. Is everything all right? Is Alexander okay? He's fine. Perfect, actually. Elena stepped into the office, looking around at the half-packed space. I heard about the board meeting, about your position. Word travels fast. It was in the Wall Street Journal this morning. Elena sat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, the same chairs where they'd once planned their future together when the company was just a dream. Harrington Medical Technologies names new CEO after founder's departure. Something like that. Miles continued packing, not trusting himself to look directly at her. Probably for the best. The company was bigger than any one person anyway. Miles. Elena's voice was soft but firm. Look at me. He stopped packing and met her gaze. In the afternoon light filtering through his office windows, she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Strong, intelligent, beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with careful styling or expensive clothes. I've been thinking, Elena said, about what you said at the hospital, about wanting to be Alexander's father, about proving you can put someone else's needs first. Miles felt his chest tighten. Elena, let me finish. She took a deep breath. For the past month, you've shown up every day. You've prioritized Alexander over everything else. Your company, your reputation, your financial security. You've gone to therapy, taken parenting classes, learned about infant development. That's what I should have done from the beginning. Yes, it is. But you're doing it now. Elena shifted Alexander in her arms as he made soft, sleeping sounds. Yesterday, Dr. Jennifer Reynolds called to check on Alexander's progress. She mentioned how impressed she was with both of us during his hospitalization, how we worked together as a team. Miles wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but something in Elena's tone made him abandon his packing completely. Elena, what are you trying to tell me? I'm trying to tell you that I've been watching you become the man I always hoped you could be, not the man you were when we got married, and not the man you became when success went to your head. Someone new, someone better. The words hit Miles harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. Does that mean? It means I think we should try, Elena said quietly. Not marriage, not moving back in together, nothing that dramatic. But maybe we could try being a family. Really being a family with both of us present and committed to making it work. Miles felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. After months of assuming he'd lost Elena forever, the possibility of rebuilding what they'd had felt almost too enormous to process. What would that look like? He asked carefully. I don't know exactly. Maybe you could come to dinner a few times a week. Help with bedtime routines. Be there for the ordinary moments, not just the emergencies. Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Maybe we could go to couples therapy together. Learn how to communicate without hurt and resentment. And if it doesn't work? If we can't get past everything that happened? Elena looked down at Alexander, who was starting to stir in her arms. Then at least Alexander will grow up knowing his parents tried. That we put his needs first and did our best to give him a stable, loving home. Miles moved around the desk to sit in the chair next to Elena's, close enough to see the tiny details of Alexander's face, the way his eyebrows were starting to look like Elena's, the small dimple in his chin that matched Miles's own. Elena, I need you to know something, Miles said. Losing the company, starting over professionally, none of that scares me. What terrifies me is the possibility of hurting you again. Of disappointing you, or failing Alexander, or reverting to who I used to be when things get stressful. Elena was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Do you remember what you used to say when we first started the company? When we were working out of that tiny apartment and living on ramen noodles? Miles smiled at the memory, that every day was a chance to build something that hadn't existed before. Exactly. You said that the best part wasn't achieving success, it was the daily choice to keep building, even when we didn't know if it would work. Elena shifted Alexander to her other arm. Maybe that's what we need to do now. Make the daily choice to keep building, even though we don't know if it will work. Miles reached out tentatively, and Elena let him take one of Alexander's tiny hands in his own. Their son's fingers immediately curled around Miles's thumb with surprising strength. I fired my therapist, Elena said suddenly. Miles looked at her in surprise. What? Dr. Collins, the therapist I'd been seeing since the divorce. I fired her because she kept telling me I should protect myself from getting hurt again. She said trusting you was a mistake, that people don't really change, that I should focus on building a life that didn't include you at all. Maybe she had a point. Maybe she did. But watching you with Alexander, seeing you choose him over everything else, that's not the man she was warning me about. That's not the man I divorced. Elena met Miles's gaze directly. "I think people can change, if they want to badly enough, if they have the right reasons." Alexander opened his eyes at that moment, looking up at both his parents with the serious expression that newborns sometimes wore. Miles felt a profound sense of responsibility settle over him, not the overwhelming panic he'd felt when Elena first told him she was pregnant, but a calm certainty about what mattered most. "I want to try," Miles said. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. I want to try building something with you and Alexander, even if it means starting completely over. New careers, new priorities, new ways of being together." Miles thought about the empty penthouse waiting for him, the stack of job offers from competitors who wanted to hire the former CEO of Harrington Medical Technologies, the life of comfortable isolation he could choose if he wanted to avoid the risk of failing Elena again. Then he looked at his son, who was still gripping his thumb, and at Elena, who was offering him something he'd never thought he'd have again, a chance to be part of a family, especially if it means starting over, Miles said. Elena smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Miles had seen on her face since Christmas Eve. "Good, because I already signed the lease on a bigger apartment, one with a second bedroom that could work as a nursery or an office depending on how things go." "You did?" "I did. And I told the publishing house I'd be interested in freelance work instead of full-time employment. More flexibility for family time." Elena's smile turned slightly mischievous. "I also may have mentioned to Dr. Jennifer Reynolds that Alexander's father was looking for ways to be more involved in his care. She said the hospital always needs volunteers for their new parent support groups." Miles felt a laugh building in his chest, the first genuine laughter he'd experienced in months. "You've been planning this." "I've been hoping for this," Elena corrected. "There's a difference." Alexander chose that moment to make a soft cooing sound, and both his parents turned their attention to him immediately. He was awake and alert, studying their faces with the intense focus that meant he was learning something new about his world. "What do you think, buddy?" Miles asked softly. "Ready to give your old man a chance to figure out this parenting thing?" Alexander's response was to grip Miles's thumb even tighter and make another small sound that both parents chose to interpret as approval. Outside the office windows, Manhattan hummed with its usual energy. Ambitious people building careers, closing deals, chasing success that would probably never feel like enough. But inside this space that had once been the center of Miles's universe, three people sat together planning something more difficult and more important than any business venture: how to become a family. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, arguments, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface. But for the first time since Christmas Eve, Miles felt like he was exactly where he belonged, and that was worth more than any company he could ever build. 18 months later, the sound of Alexander's laughter filled the sunny kitchen of Elena's, their apartment on a Saturday morning in June. At 18 months old, he was a whirlwind of curiosity and energy, currently fascinated by the way his plastic blocks made different sounds when dropped on various surfaces. Miles sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, building towers for Alexander to knock down, marveling at how much joy he found in this simple routine. His son had Elena's intelligent eyes and her stubborn determination, but Miles was beginning to see traces of his own personality emerging, a methodical way of examining new toys, a preference for routine that bordered on obsession. "Higher, Daddy," Alexander demanded, his vocabulary expanding daily with new words that delighted both his parents. "Higher it is," Miles said, adding another block to the tower. Alexander immediately knocked it down with both hands, squealing with delight. Elena appeared in the doorway, dressed for her morning run in athletic clothes that showed off the strength she'd rebuilt after pregnancy. She'd completed her master's degree in marketing the previous fall, coursework she'd managed around Alexander's schedule with Miles's support, and now freelanced for 3 different publishing houses while working on a novel she claimed was probably terrible but therapeutically necessary. "How long have you two been up?" she asked, settling on the floor beside them. "Since 5:30, Miles said. Someone decided that sunrise was the perfect time for block engineering, and you let me sleep through it? You had your deadline yesterday. You needed the rest." Miles passed Alexander a new block, watching as their son examined it with scientific precision before adding it to his collection. "Besides, we had important architectural projects to discuss." Elena smiled, and Miles felt the familiar warmth that had gradually returned to their relationship over the past 18 months. It wasn't the passionate romance of their early marriage, but something deeper, a partnership built on daily choices, shared responsibilities, and the gradual rebuilding of trust. They'd moved carefully, deliberately. Miles had kept his own apartment for the first 6 months, joining Elena and Alexander for dinner most nights, but maintaining space while they figured out how to be together without falling back into old patterns. Couples therapy with Dr. Martinez had been challenging but transformative, teaching them to communicate without defensiveness, to address problems before they became resentments. The turning point had come 8 months earlier, when Alexander had taken his first steps, from Elena's arms to Miles's, back and forth across the living room, while both parents cheered. That night, Elena had asked Miles to stay over for the first time since the divorce, not for romance, but because she wanted Alexander to wake up to both his parents celebrating his milestone. "What's your plan for today?" Elena asked, stretching beside them on the floor. "Story time at the library at 10, then the park if the weather holds. Margaret wants to have lunch with us around 1. She's bringing pictures from her cruise." Miles checked his watch, a simple steel piece that had replaced the luxury timepieces of his CEO days. "What about you?" "Long run, then I want to work on chapter 12. My editor thinks I'm being too hard on the male protagonist." Miles raised an eyebrow. "The one who abandons his pregnant wife?" "The very one. Apparently, readers need to see his redemption arc earlier in the story. They need to believe he's capable of change before the halfway point." "Are you having trouble writing his transformation?" Elena was quiet for a moment, watching Alexander stack blocks with increasing concentration. "Not exactly. I think I understand how change works now. It's not one dramatic moment. It's 1,000 small choices to do better than you did the day before." Miles felt the truth of that observation in his bones. 18 months of daily therapy sessions, parenting classes, and the simple practice of showing up consistently had taught him that transformation was less about grand gestures and more about mundane reliability. Alexander toddled over to Elena, holding up a block for her inspection. "Mama, blue." "Very good, sweetheart. That's definitely blue." Elena kissed the top of his head, inhaling the sweet scent that all toddlers seem to carry. "You're getting so good at colors." Miles watched this exchange with the contentment that had gradually replaced his old need for constant achievement. He'd found work as a consultant for medical startups, helping other entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes he'd made while building Harrington Medical Technologies. The income was a fraction of what he'd earned as a CEO, but it was enough, and more importantly, it allowed him to be present for Alexander's childhood. "Miles?" Elena's voice drew him from his thoughts. "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made Miles look at her more closely. Elena was smiling, but there was nervousness underneath the expression. "What is it?" Elena glanced at Alexander, who had returned to his block tower, then back at Miles. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Miles felt his breath catch, his mind immediately racing through the implications. Another child. Another chance to be present from the beginning. Another opportunity to build the family they'd both dreamed of. "How long have you known?" he asked softly. 2 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. Elena's smile grew more confident as she watched his reaction. 8 weeks along, due in February. Miles moved closer to her on the floor, reaching for her hands. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," Elena said honestly, "and excited, and grateful that this time, I won't have to do it alone." "You'll never have to do anything alone again," Miles said, meaning it with every part of himself. Alexander chose that moment to toddle back to them, sensing the emotional weight of his parents' conversation. He climbed into Miles's lap, then reached for Elena, wanting to be part of whatever was happening. "Baby," Alexander said solemnly, as if he somehow understood the news they'd just shared. Elena and Miles looked at each other in surprise. "Did he just?" Elena started. "Baby," Alexander repeated, patting Elena's stomach with the gentle precision that all toddlers seem to possess around pregnant women. "I think our son has excellent intuition," Miles said, adjusting Alexander in his lap. "What do you think, buddy? Ready to be a big brother?" Alexander considered this question seriously, then nodded. "Baby," he said again, as if confirming his approval. Elena laughed, the sound bright and full of joy. "Well, that settles it then." As they sat together on the kitchen floor surrounded by scattered blocks, Miles felt a profound sense of completion. Not the desperate satisfaction of professional achievement, but the quiet contentment of being exactly where he belonged. He thought about the man he'd been 2 years ago, driven by ambition, isolated by success, unable to see beyond his own needs and fears. That man had built a billion-dollar company and nearly lost everything that mattered. This man, sitting on his kitchen floor with his son and the woman he loved, had learned a different kind of success, one measured in bedtime stories and first words, in difficult conversations and shared responsibilities, in the daily choice to put family before everything else. Outside their apartment windows, New York City hummed with its usual energy. Somewhere in the concrete jungle, ambitious people were chasing dreams that might cost them more than they were willing to pay. But inside this warm space filled with children's laughter and the promise of new life, 3 people, soon to be 4, had found something more valuable than any empire. Miles pulled Elena closer, feeling Alexander settle contentedly between them. In 18 months, they'd rebuilt their relationship from the ground up, learning to be partners instead of strangers, parents instead of competitors, a family instead of 2 people who happened to share a history. "I love you," Miles said quietly, the words carrying weight they hadn't held in years. "I love you too," Elena replied, her hand finding his over Alexander's head. "All of you." As Alexander babbled contentedly about his blocks and the morning light streamed through their windows, Miles understood that this was what happiness looked like. Not the rush of closing a deal or the satisfaction of professional recognition, but the simple peace of being surrounded by people who knew him completely and loved him anyway. It had taken losing everything he thought he wanted to find everything he actually needed. And finally, that felt like enough. What do you think about second chances? Do you believe people can truly change when they have the right motivation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.